I wanted to switch gears a little bit from the food plot series that we've been doing and talk about the top 5 considerations for purchasing a hunting property. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I actually just went through this process myself. I sold my existing hunting property and I'm purchasing a new one. And it made me think about, what are the things that I look for when purchasing a hunting property. So number one, let's talk about access. There are a couple points to make about access. A lot of people are familiar with having multiple access points, which is great. But one thing that most people don't talk about is whether you have direct access or a deeded right-of-way. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with a deeded right-of-way, but what that means is you have to have a legal way to get to your property. And so that means it's permission to access through someone else's property. So typically it means it's landlocked. You only have one access point and you don't legally own that access. So that's a consideration that I don't think a lot of people think about. How many access points does it have? Obviously, that's important. A lot of people are already familiar with that. So in this property, the one that I just recently purchased, I have direct access along this road. And there are 2 logging roads that actually come in off of the road and go through the property like this. They're both drivable, pretty much to the end. It gets about right there. So if you're looking at this, I can access any point along this eastern edge. I can access along the southern edge here. And one of the things that I'm actually want the improvements I'm going to make is I'm going to put a new road that comes in like this, so I can access along the entire southern border. And then obviously this road up here accesses the entire northern border. So aside from an east wind, I can pretty much access, with my scent blowing off the property. So if it's a south wind, a west wind, a north wind, or any variation of that, a northeast wind, a southwest wind, a northwest wind, any wind direction other than due east, I can pretty much access without alerting the deer. So that leads us to the third point of access, which is what is the predominant wind direction for your area? And you can find that by using a local wind rose. That just tells you what's the typical wind direction, and you can look at it by month. So the predominant wind direction for my area is a westerly wind. So either a northwest, west, or southwest, which is great for having a road along the eastern part of the property. That leads us to the second consideration. What is the habitat like? What's the terrain like? Do you have edge features? Is the property a monoculture or is it diverse? So if you're looking at this property in particular, you can see there are a lot of different edge features and they go, different directions. And obviously, for most of us, we know that deer are creatures of the edge. They like to travel along edges. They also like to travel based on terrain. And if you notice, not only are there a lot of edge features here, but you can see the terrain. So, this is a big bottom, and it's got little fingers that jut off that are also low areas. And then you've got more elevated areas like these. And so if you're looking at that and take all that into consideration, there are a lot of different features that this property offers to promote deer movement. You've got western facing slopes, southwestern facing slopes. You've got, a hilltop here, and this is pretty much the top of this ridge. And so it offers a lot in terms of, what you can do with the property. So when you're looking at it, pull up the contour maps, pull up a 3D map if you have one or you have access to one, and see what are the features that this property offers. Another thing to consider with what the property offers, the terrain, the habitat, are the surrounding properties similar? So if you notice, there are a lot of young pine stands all around this area. These are older pines, but you notice this is a lot of previous cutover that was replanted in pines, and then of course you got some oak bottoms. So no real crop fields, no large oak, hickory forests. It's pretty much pines and oak bottoms. So the properties all around are very similar. And the reason that's important is because the more similar the surrounding properties, the more impact your changes will have on your deer herd, your hunting. So zoom out a little bit, see what the surrounding properties offer, and then that'll help you in deciding whether this property is right for you. The third point to consider is, are there any impediments to purchasing this property? So things like wetlands, zoning, government use programs, things like CRP, EQIP, anything that could prevent you from making the improvements you wanted to make. So if we're looking at, let's say, a wetlands map, and your property consisted of this area here, the vast majority of that, you would be limited on what you can do. It doesn't mean you can't do anything, but there are limits. And you would need to get the Army Corps of Engineers to come out, do a delineation survey. They could tell you whether or not you can make improvements and then what they are. But if you were looking at this property, for example, where about 80% of the property is wetlands, you can't go in and bulldoze. You can't bring in external material, things like gravels. Let's say you wanted to put an access trail coming along the southern part of the property. You couldn't bring gravel in. You couldn't use a bulldozer to clear the trees. That's a consideration. You might be able to cut an ATV trail, but you wouldn't be able to just outright clear a typical road. Another thing to consider is, if you had an area like this, and let's say you wanted to put a food plot somewhere, you can plant a food plot, but sometimes you're limited on whether or not you can, bring trees in. Let's say you got potted trees or anything with fill dirt. You can't bring it in and change the soil structure in a wetland. Another impediment might be zoning. So in this example, and this is a zoning map, this area is all really urban, neighborhoods, commercial, all that kind of thing. And this area is like zoned agricultural. So depending on how your property is zoned, agricultural, you could go in here, you could cut the timber, make food plots, put a cabin, you could camp, whatever. But if it's not zoned agricultural, you might be limited on what improvements you can make. Another thing to think about is, what are the potential financial impediments or equipment needs that you require to make your improvements. So we were looking at a property like this where it's just a large mature timber forest. In order to create food plots and bedding cover, you might need to hire a bulldozer, or you might need a forestry mulcher to come in. Let's say you want to expand this access and then create a large food plot in this corner. That's a lot of timber to cut out. You might need a bulldozer to cut this road and then clear your food plot. If you wanted to create bedding pockets, whether you hire the work out, or again, whether you need a bulldozer, or if you can hire a crew to come in and cut. But those are all things that you need to think about in terms of the financial cost or the equipment cost to implement your habitat plan. The fourth consideration is neighbors, and this one can be a little bit tricky, but one of the biggest points is how many neighbors does this property have? So if we were looking at this property, for example, this large property here, I mean, this is a good sized property, but this would be difficult to monitor because of the sheer volume of neighbors. I mean, each one of these parcels is a neighbor that could potentially trespass, hinder your hunting, depending on what activities they're doing. And that's the next point that I wanted to talk about, is what activities are each of the neighbors doing. It's not always easy to figure that out, but if you had, let's say, this property up here was just dirt bike trails and four-wheeler trails, and there were constantly people riding, that's a consideration. But the biggest point is, how many neighbors do you have? I would say the less the better. If you had, one or two neighbors, ideally, hopefully you could get in good standing, form a relationship with those neighbors. If they also hunt, you could collaborate and maybe even kind of work together to improve both of your properties. But the more neighbors you have, the more difficult it's going to be to control the deer movement on your property. There's going to be a lot more human pressure, especially if any of the neighbors hunt. And then the other thing is, if those neighbors hunt, what improvements do they have on their property? If we were looking at, let's say, these two properties here, maybe this is a food plot. Maybe this property has stands all along this edge. That could potentially impact the hunting in this section of your property. So all of these things, need to be looked at before making your purchase. It'd be really disappointing to not do this research ahead of time. You buy this property, you think you've got, 20 acres down here or whatever, and you're going to make improvements, and then, this guy's riding his four-wheeler up and down accessing these stands, and he hunts 3 days a week, and all the stands are right along the property line, and no deer movement. There's just no real deer activity in this section of your property. So how many neighbors, what sort of activities are they doing? That's important. And then lastly, point number 5, what are your goals? So this isn't just necessarily, hunting goals, although that's definitely a strong consideration. But, is this going to be like a family property where you're going to bring your kids? Are you going to, put a cabin or go out and tent camp? Are you going to have a garden, or do you like riding a four-wheeler or dirt bike, and maybe you want to be able to ride occasionally? So goals are definitely a consideration too. So let's say you wanted to put a cabin and you wanted to use an existing opening. So, this section of your property you're accessing to make, to get to your cabin. So maybe you don't make any improvements in this area. Maybe this is just kind of what I like to call a dead zone, and you leave it that way. So you're not attracting deer down here to the areas where you're going to be accessing regularly, and your kids are going to play and your dog might run around. So what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? That's important. What's the historical hunting been like? If you could talk to one of the neighbors, or maybe if the existing owner, the previous owner, had game cameras, you could get some of those historical pictures. If they've had successful hunts, what were the deer like that they were able to harvest? So that's another consideration in terms of goals. If your area only can produce 125-inch deer and your goals are 150 inches and up, then this is not the right area for you. You need to consider either a different location, a different county, or maybe even a different state. So figure out what your goals are. See if this property meets your goals based on what your plans are, what the herd's like, what your access is like, and your hunting's going to be able to be like. All of the criteria that can help you meet your goals. So just to recap, the top 5 considerations for buying a hunting property. Number 1, is access. How many points of access? Is it direct access or deeded right of way? Will your access points allow you to get in and out undetected and hunt without pressuring your deer herd? Number two, what sort of habitat, terrain, and edge features does it offer? So you've got topography, you've got different edge features where the habitat changes. Or if it doesn't currently offer, can you make improvements to vary up the habitat? So obviously you can't change topography with so much, but edge features you can change. If it was an existing pasture land, you can plant pockets of trees. You can seed switchgrass or pollinator mix, native wildflowers, shrubs, create food plots. Anything that you can do to vary up the habitat and create more edge. Number three, impediments. Do you need equipment to come in and create roads or bulldoze openings? Do you have wetlands or zoning? Number four, how many neighbors do you have? What sort of activities do the neighbors participate in? So if you had one neighbor here, one neighbor here, one neighbor here, less likely of having trespassing issues. And then number five, what are your overall goals? What are you trying to do with the property? If it's recreational, can you do everything that you want to do to turn it into a farm, family land, hunting property? Just make sure that the area and the property itself can meet the goals that you're hoping for. These are the things that I look for in purchasing a property, and hopefully they'll help you with purchasing your next hunting property.